Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Hoffman, the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and I'm delighted that today Marc Freedman is joining us for the next hour in our Friday speaker series. Let me say a few things about Marc. I've known Marc since his time at Civic Ventures. The two of us spent 3 or 4 days together. This is long ago, around scenario forecasting. And there is a way in which we have led a parallel life in this world called the longevity revolution. And you have been an extraordinary leader. You went from Civic Ventures to Encore.org, and now you have in Encore, the Experience Corps and the Purpose Prize, all of which were incredibly important for marking who we are, where we are right now in our thinking about generations. Your most recent book is called How to Live Forever, The Enduring Power of Connecting Generations. It is really delightful, here's what the book looks like. And it's a great read. It's an inspiring read. And the life that you've led, not only in sort of capturing the generations, but also the power of mentoring. I want to also say that as your leadership, you have often coined phrases or captured moments in this world where we have, 4 or 5 generations living at the same, in the same era. And I will always remember the time when you talked, I think it was on NPR, about what it was like to travel away from home, call the hotel, make a reservation, ask for the AARP discount and 2 cribs, since your sons had just been born. So, or roughly, still in crib land. So, Marc, I want to share how much I think you've meant to a lot of us who are working in the longevity revolution, and we're really looking forward to what's on your mind today. So I want to hand over the time. I want to just simply say to people, please, if you want to ask any questions, you can put them in the chat, but we also are encouraging people to raise their hand and we'll call upon you. Marc will talk for 45 minutes. This talk will be recorded and captioned, and all of you who are on the Zoom today will receive a link to the posting on YouTube, and we really hope you will share it. All right. Thanks a lot, Marc. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. And the feeling is mutual and emphatic. I've been such a fan of the OLLI movement and of what the UC Berkeley OLLI has been doing. And I've long hoped to have a chance to talk to the OLLI members. I thought I would give a talk that's maybe a little less formal than usual, and that has more of a personal element to it as well, because I'm feeling like this is a landmark year in my own life. I'm going to turn 65 in 2 months, and our organization, which is about to turn 25, has just changed our name yet again. We must have some kind of identity crisis, but after a long chapter as Encore focused on second acts for the greater good, we've moved into a new one around the idea of CoGenerate and cogeneration, which is how older and younger people can come together to forge bonds and solve problems, bridge divides, and co-create a better future. And I think it's an extremely timely focus, because we're now, as Susan was suggesting, an extraordinarily age diverse society with 4 or 5 generations alive at the same time. And that's a theme I'm going to return to. But I thought I'd start and just tell you a little bit about how I ended up working on these issues. It wasn't something that was part of a grand plan. I showed up in college, at college in 1976, utterly unprepared for that experience. And I managed in my first year to set what must be some kind of intercollegiate record in incomplete classes. I had 9 in my first 2 years, and in order to get an incomplete at the institution I was attending, you had to fill out a form and you had to ask the professor, but ultimately you had to go see a wizened 70-something dean by the name of Gilmore Stott. And I had so many incompletes and so many visits to Gilmore Stott that he became a close friend and mentor to me. And really, in some ways, the relationship with Gil forged my whole perspective on the world, which is still animating everything that I do today. And it was, when I think back about those times, he never gave me advice. He mostly was a listening ear, and I thought that was a really much needed element of our relationship. But after I finished college and graduate school and went to the world of work, I didn't go to work on issues of aging. I focused on children's issues, and I was particularly interested in the power of relationships in the lives of young people, probably an echo of that bond that I had with Gil Stott, that it had such an impact on my life. And it was a time when most of the experts in areas like education and social policy were very technically oriented. I remember people talking about teacher-proof curricula, how we could get that messy human element out of education entirely. And this was at great odds with what young people would say. If you went to talk to young people in schools or in after school settings, they always wanted to talk about a person. It was always about a relationship, a teacher, a coach, a mentor, somebody who had come into their lives and shown an interest in them. And I felt so strongly that what the young people were saying was right and needed to be vindicated. And so, along with colleagues at the organization I was working at, we did the first study that had ever been done of big brothers, big sisters, which had been around for a century, was a household word, but had never actually been studied. And it turns out it was very receptive for research, because they had a waiting list of kids who were waiting a year and a half. That was 30,000 young people. So we took 1,000 young people, half of them got big sisters and big brothers, and the other half waited the 18 months. And we wanted to see what the difference was at the end of the 18 months. There was a 46% difference in kids using drugs, a 50% difference in school truancy, and a 33% difference in violent behavior. These results outstrip the most heralded drug prevention, violence prevention programs by massive factors. In fact, the effect of the program was so profound that we were convinced that we'd put a decimal in the wrong place. But it turns out that there was no decimal in the wrong place, but just a powerful testimony in the importance of relationships in the lives of young people. The less uplifting result is, if these programs and these connections were so important, why were 30,000 kids waiting on a waiting list at a time that the program was only serving 70,000 young people? Almost half were waiting for 18 months. And it raised a fundamental question of where the human beings were who could do the things that only people could do. And it turns out at that time, Big Brothers Big Sisters and a lot of mentoring programs were focused on recruiting adults in their 20s and 30s who barely had enough time to spend with their own kids, much less someone else's child. And that one of the key ingredients in mentoring was spending 10 to 12 hours a month. And so it occurred to me, again, probably as a result of the relationship I'd had with Gil Stott, this older mentor, when I was in my teens and 20s, that there was a potential solution in the rapidly growing older population, which is set to double over the next 20 years. At that point, a change that's already happened. And older people were then the group in society which was most in search of purpose, watching the most television compared to any other group had the most discretionary time. And, this is an era before Netflix. People were watching, reruns of Gilligan's Island. So it wasn't exactly the highest and best use of people's time. And it just seemed like there was a fit there between what older people could give and what young people were needing. And it was a fit that it seemed was untapped. And so I traveled around the country to try to find out if this is happening anywhere. And I had a deeply moving experience going from city to city, looking at innovations which were pairing the generations. And the most profound was in Portland, Maine, where I went to see a foster grandparent program, which was happening in the children's ward of Maine Medical Center, best hospital in the state at that time. And I met two women, Aggie Bennett and Louise Casey, who described themselves as having failed retirement. Aggie had been a waitress. Louise had worked in a sawmill. They'd both retired, were really unhappy. Aggie said she wanted to wear away, not rust away. And when I showed up to the pediatrics ward of Maine Medical Center, it was Halloween, and Aggie was dressed as a tiger, and she was chasing kids around the hall. And I remember her telling me that it wasn't a job, it was a joy. And these two women and their peers formed deep bonds with children, and it couldn't have come at a better time in the lives of the young people, or in a more important setting, because Maine Medical Center, being the best hospital in the state, was where kids who had the most severe illnesses ended up going. Oftentimes they live 4 or 5 hours away. So you're 8 years old, you've got cancer or something else that's a major health challenge. You're far from home, you're in an institutional setting. And then after a week or two, your parents have to leave because they're working as waitresses or in a sawmill, and they got 3 other children and they can't afford to lose their jobs. So you're far away from home in institutional setting, and you're alone. And that's where Aggie and Louise came in. They really became family to these children. William Blake has a line that joy and woe are woven fine. And for all the joy, there was a lot of woe. I remember Aggie showing me an obituary of a young girl named Susan who had died at 13, who had congestive heart failure, couldn't talk to her parents about it because it was so upsetting. So she talked to Aggie. And when she died, in the obituary, it said she was survived by her parents, her siblings, and a foster grandparent, Aggie Bennett. And so, I learned a lot, as much from Aggie and Louise as I did from Gil Stott. And they taught me something that Maggie Kuhn, the founder of the Gray Panthers, once articulated. She said, we don't have a single person to waste, much less the most experienced segment of the population. And that was on full display on that pediatrics ward. And it also reminded me of a poem by Marge Piercy, To Be of Use, which says, the pitcher cries for water to carry and a person for work that is real. And I learned that we don't have a single person to waste, and also the power of purpose from Aggie and Louise. And it inspired me, along with Linda Freed, who's now the Dean of the Public Health School at Columbia, to start a program called Experience Corps, which was particularly focused on recruiting the Aggie and Louises of the world to work with young people in school settings. And at the end of the first phase of research for Experience Corps, it vindicated all of the findings about the importance of relationship that we saw in the Big Brother, Big Sister research, and also showed how mutually beneficial these kinds of connections could be for older people. I remember that being evident early when you'd go out and visit the Experience Corps members, and we'd use the name Experience Corps to honor the experience of the older people participating, but many of them thought it was a place where you went to have experiences. So there was this great mutual benefit and doubleness of participating. And that was shown in research that Linda conducted when she was at Johns Hopkins Medical School, which has shown that participation in Experience Corps reversed the preconditions of dementia for the older people. And it was the connections that were formed, the physical activities. It was a great bulwark against loneliness and isolation. I remember an Experience Corps member in Philadelphia named Martha Jones, who one day told me a story about how in a February cold East Coast morning, she went to get out of bed to go be part of Experience Corps at the Taylor Elementary School, and she just didn't feel up to it. She wasn't feeling great emotionally, and she pulled the covers back over herself and was going to stay in bed all day. And, we now know that those kinds of experiences can spiral, but because she knew that the young people at the school were going to miss her, she finally forced herself to get up and get dressed and take the bus to school. And she was hanging her coat up. It was an old 1920s school building on a hook. And she recalls these two little arms climbing up behind her, thinking to herself, somebody loves me. So, in the end, I feel like Experience Corps was a wonderful, and it's run by AARP now, vehicle for teaching young people how to read. But more than anything else, it was a crucible for love flowing up and down the generational chain. And in fact, emotionally, in terms of the research done, the benefits for the younger people in the program and the older people, the question at the end of Experience Corps for me, at least the first phase, was, why do we even need Experience Corps at all? These relationships are so powerful, they're so natural, these grandparent-like bonds. Why do we need a program? Many of the older people in Experience Corps were living within walking distance of the schools where they were serving. And that really opened up a whole set of questions that I've spent a lot of the last 5-10 years thinking about. And the answer is that these kinds of bonds don't happen naturally nearly as much as they should, because we screwed things up magnificently. That a century ago, at the beginning of the 20th century in the United States, we were one of the most age-integrated societies in the world. Every aspect of life involved people of all ages. Multi-generational households were the norm. In an agrarian economy, older and younger people work side by side. Even those one-room schoolhouses of yore had 4-year-olds and 50-year-olds learning the alphabet side by side. In fact, age was an irrelevant aspect of life. People did not know how old they were. Birthdays were not celebrated. If you asked somebody in 19th century America how old they were, it'd be like asking somebody their blood type today. Nobody would even know. And then in the early part of the 20th century, we started reorganizing society by age. And in many ways, that was the result of far-reaching progressive reforms. Child labor laws, the invention of high schools, led young people to be congregated in settings exclusively with young people. Social Security, to my mind, the great triumph of social policy over the last century, did have, though, as an explicit goal, getting older people out of the workforce during the heart of the Depression, when we had 20% unemployment in young people. We were worried about social unrest. And then one after another, we invented a set of institutions, senior centers, retirement communities, nursing homes, that put older people primarily in settings with other older people. And the generational twains stopped meeting. Young people were in schools, middle people were in workplaces, older people were in older only settings. And that trend really cemented and became accelerated in the 1950s. In America. The first Social Security check was given out in 1941. Older people were gaining financial security, but they had lost a role in life. Walter Reuther, the head of the UAW, one of the most storied labor leaders in America, got up in front of his union in 1948 and described older people as too old to work, too young to die. There was this limbo land between the end of working lives and the end of life. Louis Mumford, who wrote the New Yorker's Skyline column about architecture and urban life in 1956, wrote an essay and said at no point in any society had any group been so rejected as older people today. And he said that we needed to solve this problem, and we needed to do two things. One is we had to resist in every way turning older people into versions of children, infantilizing later life, this idea of graying as playing. And the second was to make sure older people had every opportunity to be integrated into society and in daily life. In fact, the article that he laid this all out in which he said that, you know, we'd added life and health, but we added them to the wrong end of life, which he thought was a tragedy. He said, for older people, we need integration, not segregation. And that very same year, 1956, that Lewis Mumford wrote these words and said, we've got to fix this situation. A guy named Big Ben Schleifer in outside of Phoenix, Arizona, opened the first large retirement community in America called Youngtown, built around the two principles that Lewis Mumford said were at the core of the rejection of older people. One, hence the name Youngtown, was a chance for older people to become kids again, to play full time. And the second was age segregation. And what Big Ben Schleifer created in the case of Youngtown caught on. Del Webb built the first Sun City directly across the street from Youngtown. On the opening of Sun City on January 1st, 1960, 100,000 people showed up. Webb coined the phrase the golden years, and the rest is history. We ended the 20th century as the most age segregated society in the world, from the most age integrated to the most age segregated in a space of 100 years. And that's a problem for a whole set of reasons, which I wanted to talk a little bit about today. One is that separation of generations is in opposition to everything we know about human thriving. There's now a widespread belief in cultural anthropology that the reason we became human beings in the first place is the role that older people played in taking care of babies in hunter-gathering societies, which enabled both parents to go out and hunt and gather, and enable the long helpless period that human infants have, which enables us to grow these big brains and become human beings. It's called the grandmother hypothesis. So this connection between generations, not just something that's happenstance or recent, it's something that is deeply rooted in human evolution. Fast forward to what we know now, even compared to when I was involved in starting Experience Corps, we now know that the needs and the assets of older and younger people fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Yuri Bronfenbrenner, the founder of the Head Start program, one of the great child development scholars of the last century, wrote that he said, what every child needs is at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. We now know that we older people, I say that as a near 65-year-old, we need to be irrationally crazy about the younger generation. Laura Carstensen at Stanford has a theory called socio-emotional selectivity. And it argues that as we move later in life and have a sense of time becoming more compressed, it drives us towards relationship and connection. And just think about it. She's done this with people of all ages. If somebody tells you you have a month left to live, you don't think, wow, this is a great time to go learn the oboe, or I've always wanted to study Mandarin. You focus on loved ones and connection. And it turns out that as we get older, our knees might creak, but we get better at relationship and connection, empathy, emotional regulation. All of these relationship skills blossom as we move further into life. And finally, there's a direction to all that connection. There's a new book out called The Good Life by Robert Waldinger, a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, who's led for recent decades the longest longitudinal study of happiness in adulthood. And this book is all about the power of relationship, and it argues that happiness is love, full stop, to quote Waldinger. But there's a direction to that happiness, and it flows downhill. Waldinger's predecessor, George Valen, who also at Harvard Medical School, has a great phrase: biology flows downhill. And by that, he means that connecting, mentoring, supporting, working together with younger generations is the key to happiness. Older people who do that, who work together with younger generations, forge these bonds, whether it's in families or outside them, are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so. You know, there's a book out there, 10% Happier, that sold millions of copies. So this is 300% more likely to be happy. So there's something fundamental in the human experience at play here that we've upended, and that we need to resurrect, as Lewis Mumford was saying all those years ago, that and fighting segregation and integrating older people in key ways in society. And I think one of the main points I wanted to make today is that there's good news on this front. For all the ways that we've reorganized society to separate generations, and particularly older people, we're now seeing movement in the opposite direction. And I'm enormously heartened by that. It reminds me of a story that David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, tells. He wrote in one of his books that about a guy in Los Angeles who buys a new house that has a bamboo grove, and he hates bamboo. So he goes to Ace Hardware and buys a bunch of tools and chops down the bamboo. Then he, just to be sure, he buys bamboo poison and pours that over where the bamboo used to be. And then, to be absolutely sure, he brings in a contractor who paves over where the bamboo had lived. And a year later, the bamboo's breaking through the sidewalk. And in a way, this impulse to connect across generations, to do so in mutually beneficial ways, it's so deeply part of the human experience, the fabric of life, that this aberration we've had over the last century, I think, is being upended in myriad ways. We've seen a 4-fold increase in recent decades in multi-generational housing. 60 million Americans now are living in multi-generational households. So it's happening on the ground. It's happening in the air too, actually literally on the air. I don't know how many of you have had the chance over the last couple of years to watch shows like Hacks or Only Murders in the Building, which bring older and younger people together in powerful ways to do things that neither could do on their own. That these shows are not only great parables for our multi-generational future, but they are also, I think, really high quality. They're winning all these awards and getting tens of millions of viewers. Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga are winning Grammys together. There's a cultural shift. You know, I'm so used to seeing ageism and these ageist tropes, but there's a counter narrative that I think is gaining significant steam, and it's in films as well. Going back to The Intern, now A Man Called Otto with Tom Hanks has got a lot of those same themes. And it couldn't be more timely because, as I said at the beginning, and as Susan alluded to, we are the most age diverse society that has ever been assembled. Right now, there are 23% of the population is over 60, 25% is under 20, and 52% is in between. And the Stanford Center on Longevity did a report this past year, the New Map of Life, which showed that age diversity goes even further. From age 0 to 74, we have approximately the same number of people at every age. There's the same number of 24-year-olds and 57-year-olds and 43-year-olds and 72-year-olds. So as much as we're in a longevity revolution, we're an aging society, the big story really is this, Susan used that phrase, 4 and 5 generations alive together. it's really, in many cases, 5 and 6. And that number is going to go beyond 74. And we're going to continue to have this extraordinary age diversity. But age diversity and age segregation does not work well together. It leads to all of these potential conflicts we hear about. It leads to the prevalence of ageism. It leads to isolation and loneliness. And again, in Lewis Mumford's injunction, it's something that we need to turn around. But I am seeing that transformation starting to happen with greater intensity. One of my favorite new examples is Third Act, which is Bill McKibben's startup bringing older and younger people together around climate. And he's a wonderful writer, writes for the New Yorker. He has these great phrases. Fossils against fossil fuels is one of their lines. He also started a program called Seniors to Seniors, in which older people are helping high school seniors vote, registering them to vote. So it's a wonderful example of cross-generational collaboration. And there's so many other illustrations around the country, around the world. I don't know how many of you, since I talked a little bit about pop culture and TV before, there's a scene in another wonderful show, The Kominsky Method on Netflix, that I think captures the problem that we're facing. In it, Michael Douglas has been diagnosed with prostate cancer. He's in great financial straits and is generally depressed state. And he decides to take a walk in the park. And he does that while talking to his daughter on the phone. And he hears off in the distance the sound of children playing at a playground. And he navigates his way to the playground and sits down, and his mood brightens. He hears these peals of laughter and joy from children. And in the background, and kind of fuzzy, out of focus, you first see one mother, then two mothers, joined by a third, and then a policeman arrives. And Michael Douglas is narrating this whole scene to his daughter. And says, they've called the cops. This idea of an older person showing up at a playground. But one of the most wonderful counterexamples I saw, I went back to Maine when I was working on this book, to a place called Gorham House, which is a senior living facility outside of Portland, which has a preschool built right into its front entrance. You come straight in to go to the senior living facility. You make a right entrance to go into the preschool, which engages residents at Gorham House as surrogate grandparents for the children. And in the front of Gorham House is a playground, not that dissimilar from the one in the Kominsky Method. And the most prized rooms at Gorham House are the ones that overlook the playground. There's so many innovations happening in housing. Another one of my favorites is Judson Manor in Cleveland, which is a senior living community focused on people who are interested in the arts. I think a lot of Ollie Berkeley members would feel right at home at Judson Manor. It's poised between the Cleveland Clinic on one side and all of the main cultural institutions of Cleveland Case Western University, Severance Hall, where the orchestra plays. And they came up with the idea of providing free housing to graduate students in music and art in return for doing art for the public spaces at Judson Manor, for playing concerts. And I remember I showed up there on a cold November day, and there were 25 Swedish social scientists who had come to Cleveland, from Denmark and Sweden and Scandinavian social scientists, to find a better way to have an age diverse society. And they came to the right place, because the kinds of things that happen when you combine proximity and purpose, people of different generations living close to each other, but having this great shared interest in culture and the arts. I met a woman named Carla, who was in her 90s, who'd lived next to a young violist, a young woman who married another young violist. And when they planned their wedding, they didn't invite Carla. They asked her to be the maid of honor. So just one of these beautiful examples of what can happen when there is this combination of purpose and proximity. I could give lots of other examples, and in the Q&A, I'm happy to do that. But I think the main message that I want to deliver overall is that we're at a critical juncture. We are becoming this extraordinarily age-diverse society. We are trying to shake free of this aberrant history of generational segregation. It's happening in important places. And I think we're at what the Harvard law professor Cass Sunstein, who's the guy who invented the idea of nudge, calls a norm change moment, where the old norm, which seems like the oxygen in the air, of course generations are separated. That, you know, it just seems, if that's all we've known, that seems like the default position. But in fact, it's a terrible way to organize society, and especially for a society that's at a multi-generational moment. And there are all these ways in which it's being disrupted in culture and social innovation and housing. And I think it's not gonna change easily. It won't happen automatically. The census was completed last year, and the fastest growing metropolitan area in America was none other than the Villages in Florida, that home of MAGA politics and radical age segregation. There's a documentary that Netflix put out a couple years ago called Some Kind of Heaven, which is about the Villages. And I think a lot of people worry that our future is going to look a lot like the Villages, but I think there's an alternative. It's already taking shape. We're going to need to overcome a failure of imagination and thinking that this generational separation and segregation is normal. We're going to need to be as creative in bringing people together across generations as we've been in splitting them apart. And we're going to need to do it at a scale that matters. You know, Big Ben Schleifer had 100 homes at Youngtown, but Del Webb had 100,000 people show up on the first day of Sun City. And I'm seeing some encouraging signs there. There's an effort, a for-profit effort called PAPA, which promises family on demand, and it brings mostly young people together with frail elders in jeopardy of social isolation to form family-like relationships. They've received $240 million in venture funding. They have a valuation that's close to $1.5 billion. So I'm starting to see some investment going in. So I think we've got to fix this problem of segregation and separation. We've got to do it now, as we at this great transition into becoming a much more age diverse society. It's already happening, and I think we can fix this problem. And if we fix it, I think it will fix us. It will reconnect us to this long-standing pattern of human behavior and human thriving. There's a great Greek proverb, which I used in the book that Susan mentioned. Society grows great when older people plant seeds plant trees under whose shade they shall never sit. And that's become a real watchword for me. I think we can create a society that works better, that's more efficient, one that has greater social cohesion. And ultimately, I think we can create a future which is infused by deeper connection, dare I say, love. And I'll use that word because Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, who's shown that loneliness and social isolation is as detrimental to our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, has similarly argued that the solution is love. It's wonderful when the Surgeon General is using that kind of plain spoken language. And it reminds me of the show Hacks, which I mentioned earlier, which is the setup for Hacks, for those of you who haven't seen it, is a 70-year-old stand-up comic whose show is canceled in Las Vegas after 25 years. who's paired together with a 25-year-old comedy writer from LA. They have the same agent who she's been canceled for an indiscreet tweet. And they're brought together to save each other's careers, which they do. And in the process, begrudgingly come to form a deep bond. The New York Times described Hacks as a love story disguised as a hate story. You know, we hear a lot about art imitating life. Well, I hope that life, our future life, comes to imitate art of the kind that we see in shows like Hacks. That's a future that I want to hand off to younger generations, and that I would want to inhabit as well. So I'll just close. That was one long 40-minute sentence, but again, thanks for the chance to talk to you about all these ideas, and please don't hesitate to raise questions, and happy to try to answer.
Well, Mark, while we're waiting for people to raise their hand and to put in questions, you and I've spoken about the various ways in which Ollie is doing intergenerational learning. And one of the things that we did this past year was a coaching program where we trained 24 Ollie members to be coaches. And it turned out we matched them with 18 students. And now the campus is interested in us moving it bigger and sort of bringing it to at least 50 people, if we can do that. And I think that experience, and then all the other experiences we've had with Words Over Time, with our co-designing the National Science Foundation grant, and then co-designing with campus centers, there is so much, as you said, it benefits ourselves as well. It benefits, you know, the young adults who, when an older adult sees them, their face brightens up. It is just, and so much incredible creativity is unleashed because of the different experiences that both generations has. I'm looking to see if anyone's raising their hand, but one of the conversations I was in several years ago was wanting to suggest that generation casting should be thrown out the window, that we should stop referring to ourselves as the boomer generation or Gen X, that there was more lost than gained by that. And, you know, the person who was, you know, speaking about this said that she would refer to herself not as a Gen Xer, but as a perennial. You know, that life has its cycles and you move in and out of, in some sense, I think she was defining herself as ready for public prime time, you know, as the perennial. She'll bloom when she's ready to, and then go underground. Whatever that is, if it's raising children or taking care of loved ones, you know, it was a sort of interesting link with nature. What do you think about generation casting? I mean, do you see its benefit as well as its potential downside?
I've never liked it either. And there's a wonderful book out by a British social scientist at King's College London named Bobby Duffy called The Generation Myth. And if you don't want to wade through the generation myth, there's a great New Yorker article or a review of it that kind of captures what he's arguing. But mostly these generation casting it's been a product of marketers, you know, as a way to reel in contracts. And I'm much more I think taken by the need to create a sense of the wholeness of life. Erik Erikson, who, you know, one of the great developmental theorists, he talked about the hallmark of life, of later life, being encapsulated in the idea of generativity. And he said that the phrase "I am what survives of me" could really capture, you know, what a rich later life. But he was just as adamant about the need to recapture a sense of the wholeness of life. And I see that with this, in this deeply age segregated world that we live in, how do young people learn how to become thriving older people if they don't have any contact, especially
Right.
outside of families? And
Right.
how do we as a society learn to be this 4 or 5 generation, 6 generation amalgam that you talked about, Susan, when we have very little practice working
Right.
together? And so I think that I think the generation casting contributes to this sense of separation, disconnection, that is almost like we cross a line. When I cross that magical 65 line in a couple months, I'm a
Right.
whole
Yeah.
different species than I was beforehand. So I think it's done a lot of harm, and needs to be retired.
Well, one phrase that seems to have been retired is the phrase, okay, boomer. That didn't have much life. I thought that was good. A sign of enlightenment. One of the conversations I've been in at the start of the year is that downtown Berkeley, the city and the Downtown Business Association and others are trying to develop a civic center, both in the public land that's there and the buildings that are owned by the city surrounding it, the Veterans Building, the old mayor's office, etc. And part of that vision, and part of what I think why I've been brought in, is to talk about it as an intergenerational, multi-generational space, that you create a new civic center by having OLLI members and high school students from, the Berkeley High School, and, students that are involved in the YMCA. And, I think you are right in predicting that. I think that there is a certain ripeness in our kind of current time to really see what's missing and how we could easily make correction to it. And so we do our small part also with campus to say, look how much benefit we have by having older adults embraced by the campus community. So does anyone have any other questions?
I think Carol had a question. Carol Crane.
Oh, she did. Carol, please.
Hi, boy, lots of this resonates with me. I do not have children, and I live about 2,700 miles from my family in Pennsylvania. And several years ago, with no knowledge or forethought, stumbled into the idea I needed more young people in my life and started doing a lot of volunteer stuff. And just as a comment to people who might be considering that, a lot of the incredibly well-intended organizations have some really strict rules about no contact with the kids outside of the parameters of the specific program you're working with. And that was actually kind of heartbreaking. You can get pretty close to a kid if you only spend 2 hours a week with them, and then suddenly you're not allowed to have any contact with them. So beware of that as a pitfall. The other thing, maybe others will have this wonderful accident that I've recently had. There's a young man in my neighborhood who, to put it bluntly, has really bad parents. And he glommed me at the age of 6. And again, no forethought on anybody's part. He is now 21. And suddenly we are best friends. And, through the years, I was always where he ran when he had a problem. And now when I have oral surgery and my dog needs walked, he's here, and it's just a terrific surprise. I never expected that I would be the beneficiary of 15 years of contact with this young man. So go find one.
There's so many, Carol, so many things that you raise. There's just natural kind of symbiosis that's waiting to happen in society. We've had a similar experience on our block. I live in Albany, and we have a couple in their 80s that live 2 doors down who become surrogate grandparents for our kids, and it's just enriched everybody's lives. Turns out that kind of connection is missing in so many places where you wouldn't even think. So Finland has just started a community grandparent program, because in Finland, it turns out that very few older people either have grandparents or live near grandchildren or live near their grandchildren. And so this idea of creating kind of fictive kin relationships has become a national project in Finland. And I'd love to see something similar here. You know, we've got such just to follow this idea of these kind of solutions waiting to happen, we've got such a labor shortage in early childhood education. Why not create a core of older people who can work in the early years that could help ease some of the human shortages? I wrote an op-ed piece last year on this idea of a caring core. I think we just need a lot more ideas in this arena. But, you know, Carol's point about how there are these restrictions and programs to doing things with the young people outside of their confines, it reminds me of when we were starting Experience Corps. One of the people who inspired us was a woman in Portland, a foster grandparent there named Cherry Hendricks, who turns out was a relative of Jimi Hendrix. And she was tutoring kids, but felt like that was too constrained to really get to know the young people. And so she was an avid bowler. So she started a bowling league for kids and hand wrote 43 permission slips to their parents and got the alley to donate lanes and shoes. And it became this way for them to get to know each other outside of the academic confines of tutoring in a school. And so I just think that's so important. Anyway, thank you for that question, Carol. And I have to say, our in-laws have moved into our back cottage, and so we now have a 3-generation household, and it works at every level. I don't want to kind of romanticize it, but we need each other, and it's there should just be more opportunities to do that.
And Mark, do you see the question from Marty about alternative living spaces?
Oh, I see that
yes.
question, but I'm glad so as and I know Carol has a follow-up question too. I'll just do a quick response to them. I feel like the two places where there's the greatest promise to go to everything Susan was saying are campuses. I think that there's a lot of potential to bring the generations together in campuses and housing, where it's as that story about Youngtown and Sun City reveals. I think housing is probably the way we've organized housing by age has done more damage than any other institution. And I think there's a chance in lots of creative ways to turn that around. Some of those examples that I gave from Judson Manor were, illustrations. But another one of my favorite efforts is this proliferation of shared housing arrangements. There's this group called Nesterly, which we've been closely involved in, which brings older people who have room to spare in their house together with young people, usually graduate students in high rent areas like the Bay Area. It started in Boston, and it's in return for reduced rent, these young people do chores around the house, and it becomes a crucible for relationships to form. And so I think there's a lot of room for creativity in housing to bring generations together. And Carol, I know you had a follow-up question you wanted to, or comment that you wanted to make. Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, I've been trying, I wouldn't unmute. Just a quick comment. You mentioned the place outside of Cleveland that has the emphasis on music. Just an FYI, there's a small college just north of Pittsburgh, La Roche College, that has begun a program. They took a dorm and they converted it to being half students, half seniors. And the students are all tech oriented. And the building is wildly tech. And so the seniors who have trouble unmuting their Zoom, et cetera, can get the assistance they need next door. no charge. And it's working out beautifully. I have a friend who's living there and it's fabulous.
That's terrific. There's so many other university-based programs that where I'm seeing kind of similar dynamics. There's been a growth of these one-year go back to college efforts, in very expensive elite settings. So Harvard started the first one called the Advanced Leadership Initiative. Stanford followed suit. Now Notre Dame and University of Texas and University of Minnesota, other places are doing the same thing, but it's a chance to go back to school for a year in 60s, 70s, 80s to figure out what to do next. And the surprise but also great discovery of these programs is that the connection with students has been one of the richest elements. And so whether it's the Ollie UC Berkeley connections that you all are doing, whether it's some of these programs like the ones I just described, the La Roche College example, I think there's a lot of potential on campuses to bring generations together and be a kind of model for reintegrating society by age. I can't stop without telling you my overall favorite example of doing this is a group that we worked a lot with called Nuns and Nuns. So every time these survey places, go out and interview generations, turns out that young people, a high percentage are classified as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, which is that spiritually oriented, but with no formal religious affiliation. And a group of these nuns, starting with Harvard Divinity School students, reached out to older women religious sisters who've dedicated their lives to fighting poverty and working on social justice, and created this project called Nuns and Nuns, N-O-N-E-S's and N-U-N-S's, to find out these young people reaching out to older generations to figure out what it means to live a good life, but they're also doing work together. They're doing voter registration drives, and just a wonderful project that always inspires me. So, Susan, I know you were about to say something because I think we're getting close to the end here.
Oh, yeah, we sure are. Are there any other comments or questions that people want to make? And if not, Mark, I am really thankful to have this hour with you, and knowing that you've got a new iteration of your organizational structure that's being launched. Is there anything that we should know about co-generativity?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that. I meant to mention it earlier. I think our focus is not just on integration of people of different ages, not just on what older people can do for younger people, like the Experience Corps example I gave earlier, or some great projects where younger people are helping older people in mutually beneficial ways. But what can older and younger people do together to improve, to co-create a better future? And I think there's a tremendous opportunity to come together on equal footing to teach and learn at the same time. And we're focused on that particular issue. Maybe I'll just close with a very quick example of what we're trying to do. There's a study of BMW, which has these 3 assembly lines, one entirely of older workers, one entirely of younger workers, and a mixed age line. And the older worker line was not that fast, but made very few mistakes. The younger worker line was quite fast and filled with errors. And the mixed line was fast and mistake-free. And I think it's a good metaphor for what we can do together that we can never do alone.
Yes. Well, thank you. That's wonderful to hear that. It's also the news, I think it was 2 days ago, of the protests in France, because the suggestion that they move the retirement age from 62 to 64 is being protested, because France has one of the longest longevity societies, where retirement age is 24 to 25 years long. I think it's an exciting time to be in. And Mark, thank you for helping
so
us.
much, and congratulations on everything Berkeley Ollie is doing.
Thank you. All right, everybody, have a great weekend.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.